The greatest empire the world had ever seen, collapsed. No final battle. No heroic last stand. Just silence, as the crown of Rome slipped away in 476 AD. An emperor was overthrown by Odoacer, and just like that, the Western Roman Empire was gone. Cities fell into chaos. Armies disappeared. Power vanished overnight. But in the middle of the collapse, one figure remained. No army. No throne. No empire. Yet somehow, he survived. While kings fought and empires crumbled, the Pope rose from the ruins, and slowly became one of the most powerful figures in history. How did a simple bishop outlast Rome itself? How did the Church go from survival or to dominance? This is the story of how the popes didn't just survive the fall of the Roman Empire. The year is 476 AD. For centuries, the Western Roman Empire had stood as the most powerful civilization the world had ever known. Its roads stretched across continents, its armies crushed nations, and its emperors ruled with absolute authority. From the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Europe, Rome was not just a city, it was the center of the world. But now, that world was collapsing. Decades of internal corruption had weakened the empire from within. Political instability turned the throne into a revolving door of short-lived emperors. Economic decline drained its strength. And beyond its borders, powerful tribes watched closely, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came. In 476 AD, a Germanic leader named Odoacer marched into Italy. There was no legendary final battle. No dramatic last stand. Instead, what happened was quieter, but far more symbolic. He deposed the young emperor Romulus Augustulus, a boy placed on the throne as a puppet ruler. The imperial crown, the symbol of centuries of Roman dominance, was sent east to Constantinople. With that single act, the Western Roman Empire officially came to an end. Rome, the eternal city, no longer had an emperor. The political structure that had governed millions simply disappeared. And with it came uncertainty. Who would protect the people? Who would maintain order? Who would lead a world that had suddenly lost its center? Across the former empire, chaos spread. Cities declined. Trade networks broke apart. Local warlords and barbarian kings carved territories for themselves. The idea of a united Roman world faded into memory. But something remarkable happened in Rome. Amid the collapse of imperial power, one institution did not fall. The Church. At the heart of it stood the Bishop of Rome, the man who would later be known as the Pope. At this moment in history, he was not a king. He commanded no armies. He had no imperial title. Yet he possessed something that no collapsing empire could take away: spiritual authority. While emperors had ruled through force, the Church ruled through belief. And belief does not collapse as easily as governments. As fear spread across the land, people turned to what remained stable. The Church provided guidance, structure, and a sense of continuity in a world that no longer made sense. Its rituals continued. Its message endured. Its leaders remained present when political rulers vanished. In a time when roads became unsafe and cities grew quiet, the Church became a network that still connected people. Bishops organized communities. They distributed aid. They preserved order at the local level. Slowly, almost quietly, the Church began to fill the vacuum left by the empire. Rome itself changed. Once the seat of emperors, it became a city searching for a new identity. The grand palaces lost their purpose. The Senate faded into irrelevance. But the Christian Church, rooted in faith rather than politics, continued to grow in influence. The Bishop of Rome, though still modest in power, now held a unique position. He was not just a religious figure. He was one of the last symbols of unity in a divided world. This transformation did not happen overnight. It was not planned. It was a response to crisis, a gradual shift as people placed their trust in what remained. The fall of the Western Roman Empire did not just mark the end of a political system. It created a vacuum, one that demanded to be filled. And in that vacuum, the foundations of a new kind of power were being laid. Not built on armies. Not built on wealth. But built on faith. The empire had fallen. But in its shadow, something new was beginning to rise. The rise of spiritual authority. The empire was gone. No emperors. No legions. No central power to protect the people of Rome. What remained was uncertainty and fear. Across Italy and beyond, former Roman lands were now controlled by rival kingdoms. Armies marched under foreign banners. Old systems of law and order were fading. For ordinary people, survival became the priority. And yet, in the middle of this chaos, one figure began to stand out. The Bishop of Rome. He had no army, no crown, no official political authority. But he had something far more powerful in a collapsing world: trust. As civil institutions disappeared, the church stepped in to fill the gaps. Bishops began organizing food distribution, resolving disputes, and maintaining a sense of order. The church became not only a spiritual guide, but a stabilizing force in daily life. And then came a moment that would redefine the power of the papacy forever. In 452 AD, long before the official fall of the empire, a terrifying threat approached Rome. Attila the Hun. Known across Europe as a destroyer of cities, Attila led a massive army that had already devastated vast regions. His name alone inspired fear. When news spread that he was marching toward Rome, panic swept through the population. There was no emperor strong enough to stop him. No army capable of resisting him. So the unthinkable happened. Instead of sending soldiers, Rome sent a priest. Pope Leo I, later known as Leo the Great, rode out to meet Attila face to face. No weapons. No defenses. Just words. What happened in that meeting remains one of history's great mysteries. Some say Leo appealed to Attila's sense of diplomacy. Others claim fear, disease, or strategic concerns forced Attila to reconsider. Legends even suggest divine intervention. But one fact is undeniable. Attila turned back. Rome was spared. And suddenly, everything changed. For the people of Rome, this was more than a political event, it was a powerful symbol. While emperors had failed to defend the city, the Pope had succeeded. Not through force, but through presence, courage, and authority of a different kind. From that moment on, the perception of the Pope shifted. He was no longer just a religious leader performing rituals inside churches. He was a protector, a negotiator, a figure capable of standing between destruction and survival. This event elevated the papacy to a new level of influence, not because it gained official power, but because people believed in its power. And belief, in times of crisis, can reshape reality. As decades passed, this growing authority continued to expand. The Church began interacting more directly with rulers, negotiating peace, and representing the interests of the population. While kings ruled territories, the Pope began to represent something larger, moral authority that crossed borders. The Church also preserved knowledge. In a world where Roman institutions were collapsing, it safeguarded literacy, texts, and traditions. Monasteries became centers of learning. Clergy became advisors not just in religion, but in governance. Step by step, the Church evolved. Not by conquering land, but by becoming essential. And the Pope stood at the center of it all. What began as spiritual leadership was now transforming into influence that could shape politics, diplomacy, and society itself. The fall of Rome had removed the old power. But it also created space for a new one to emerge. A power not built on fear, but on faith, leadership, and the ability to act when no one else could. The age of emperors was over. The age of spiritual authority had begun. Rome without emperors. The empire was gone. But power did not disappear, it changed hands. After 476 AD, Italy and much of the former Western Roman world fell under the control of new rulers, kings from so-called barbarian tribes. Among them, one stood above the rest. Theodoric the Great. He was not Roman. He did not come from the old imperial system. Yet he ruled Italy, and Rome itself. At first glance, this seemed like the end of Roman identity. A foreign king now controlled the heart of the old empire. But something unexpected happened. The new rulers did not destroy Rome's traditions. They needed them. Kings like Theodoric understood that ruling former Roman lands required more than military strength. The population was still Roman in culture, language, and lore. To govern effectively, these kings needed legitimacy, something they could not create on their own. And that legitimacy came from the Church. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, became a bridge between two worlds. On one side, the Roman population, holding onto its identity. On the other, the new rulers, seeking stability and acceptance. The Pope stood in the middle. He negotiated. He advised. He represented continuity in a time of transformation. While kings commanded armies, they often relied on Roman administrators and church leaders to maintain order. The Church, with its organized structure and educated clergy, became an essential partner in governance. And in this partnership, the Pope's influence quietly expanded. He was no longer just guiding souls. He was helping shape the political reality of a new Europe. Rome itself reflected this shift. The grand imperial institutions, the Senate, the palaces, the symbols of Caesar, continued to fade. But churches grew stronger. Christian rituals replaced imperial ceremonies. The identity of the city was changing. It was no longer the capital of an empire. It was becoming the center of a faith. Yet this new world was far from stable. While armies came and went, the Pope remained in Rome. This consistency mattered. In times of war, famine, and uncertainty, the Church became the most reliable institution left. It provided not just spiritual comfort, but practical support, organizing aid, caring for the poor, and maintaining communication between regions. The Pope's role continued to evolve. He was not crowned as a king. He did not declare himself an emperor. But functionally, he was becoming something more than a religious figure. He was a stabilizer in a fragmented world. A symbol of unity in a divided land. And perhaps most importantly, he was independent. Unlike kings, whose power depended on armies, the Pope's authority came from belief, and belief could travel beyond borders, beyond kingdoms, beyond conflict. As different rulers rose and fell, the Church remained a constant presence across Europe. And that constancy gave it strength. By the end of this period, a quiet transformation had taken place. The political map of Europe had changed completely. Rome had lost its emperors. New kingdoms had taken control. But the Pope had gained something far more enduring. Influence that did not rely on force. Influence that adapted to every new ruler. Influence that survived every war. The world of Rome was gone. But in its place, a new order was forming. One where spiritual authority and political power would become deeply intertwined. And at the center of it stood the Pope. The Church becomes a power. The Western Roman Empire was long gone. But the chaos it left behind had not disappeared. Italy was no longer the heart of a unified world. It was a contested land, fought over by rival powers. Armies marched, cities suffered, and stability remained fragile. The old Roman system had collapsed, yet no single force had fully replaced it. Except one. The Church. By the late 6th century, the Bishop of Rome was no longer just a spiritual guide. The Pope had become a central figure in the survival of the city itself. And no one represented this transformation more than Pope Gregory I. When he became Pope in 590 AD, Rome was in crisis. War had devastated the region. The Lombards, a powerful Germanic people, threatened Italy. The Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, still claimed authority over Rome, but its ability to protect the city was weak and distant. There was no strong emperor in the West. No reliable army defending Rome. No stable government ensuring order. So Gregory stepped in. Not as a conqueror, but as a leader who understood what the moment demanded. He organized the defense of Rome, not by commanding legions, but by negotiating with enemies. He communicated directly with the Lombards, working to prevent invasions and reduce violence. In a world where war was constant, Gregory used diplomacy as his weapon. At the same time, he took responsibility for the people. Food shortages and famine threatened the population. Gregory used church resources to distribute grain, feed the poor, and care for the sick. He managed lands owned by the church, turning them into a system that supported the survival of entire communities. This was not the role of a traditional religious leader. This was governance. Step by step, the Pope began to act like the ruler of Rome in all but name. He oversaw administration. He organized relief efforts. He influenced politics. He made decisions that affected thousands of lives. And importantly, he did all this while maintaining spiritual authority. This combination made the papacy unique. Kings ruled through force. Governments ruled through law. But the Pope ruled through responsibility, faith, and action. Gregory also looked beyond Rome. He sent missionaries across Europe, expanding Christianity into new regions. One of his most significant efforts was sending missionaries to convert the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, an act that would shape the future of English history. Through these missions, the influence of the Church spread far beyond Italy. It became international. While political borders constantly shifted, the Church created a network that connected distant lands under one belief system. This gave the Pope influence that no king could easily match. The transformation was now undeniable. The Church was no longer simply surviving the collapse of the Roman Empire. It was replacing many of its functions. Where the empire once collected taxes and distributed resources, the Church now managed lands and wealth. Where officials once governed cities, bishops now provided leadership. Where emperors once represented unity, the Pope now stood as a unifying figure for Christians across Europe. Rome itself had changed forever. It was no longer the capital of an empire of soldiers and senators. It had become the heart of a spiritual empire. And at its center stood the Pope, not wearing armor, not leading armies, but holding a different kind of power. A power built on trust. A power strengthened by crisis. A power that continued to grow as the world around it struggled to stabilize. By the end of Gregory's reign, the foundation had been set. The papacy was no longer reacting to events. It was shaping them. But in its place, a new order was forming. One where spiritual authority and political power would become deeply intertwined. And at the center of it stood the Pope. From survival to dominance. Centuries had passed since the fall of Rome. The world that once revolved around emperors, legions, and imperial glory was gone. In its place stood a fractured Europe, divided into kingdoms, cultures, and competing powers. But while kingdoms rose and fell, one institution had not only survived, it had grown stronger. The papacy. What began as a position of spiritual leadership had now transformed into something far greater. The Pope was no longer just guiding believers, he was shaping the destiny of Europe. And then came a moment that would redefine power itself. The year was 800 AD. In the city of Rome, on a cold winter day, a grand ceremony unfolded inside St. Peter's Basilica. A powerful king knelt before the altar. He was not Roman, but he controlled vast lands across Western Europe. His name was Charlemagne. As he knelt, the Pope stepped forward. Not as a servant, not as a subject, but as the one who would decide what came next. In a dramatic and symbolic act, the Pope placed a crown upon Charlemagne's head, declaring him Emperor of the Romans. With that single moment, history changed. The title of Emperor, once inherited through Roman bloodlines, was now granted by the Church. Power had been redefined. No longer did emperors stand above all. Now, their authority could be recognized or denied by the Pope. This was more than a coronation. It was a message to all of Europe. The papacy had the power to legitimize rulers. Kings could conquer land. They could command armies. But without recognition from the Church, their rule could be questioned. And that made the Pope something extraordinary. A kingmaker. This new relationship between Church and state created what would later be known as the Holy Roman Empire, a political system where secular rulers and spiritual authority were deeply connected. But this alliance was not simple. It was a balance of power, sometimes cooperation, sometimes conflict. Because while kings needed legitimacy, the Church also relied on protection. The Pope had influence, but he did not command armies. Partnerships with rulers like Charlemagne ensured both stability and expansion of Christian influence across Europe. And so, a new order emerged. The Pope stood at the center, not as an emperor, but as something different. A figure whose authority crossed borders. A leader whose power was rooted in belief rather than force. A voice that could shape the fate of nations. From the ruins of the Western Roman Empire, the papacy had not only survived, it had adapted, evolved, and risen. It learned to work with kings instead of replacing them. It filled the gaps left by collapsing institutions. It turned moments of crisis into opportunities for influence. What began as survival had become dominance. The Roman Empire had once unified Europe through conquest. Now, the Church was uniting it through faith, and through the authority of the Pope. Legacy of power, the world after Rome. By the early Middle Ages, the transformation was complete. The Western Roman Empire had vanished centuries earlier, but its shadow still lingered across Europe. Roads, cities, and laws remained as echoes of a lost civilization. Yet the force that now gave those remnants meaning was no longer imperial. It was spiritual. At the center of this new world stood the papacy. What began as a small religious office in a declining empire had become one of the most influential institutions in human history. The Pope now spoke not just to the people of Rome, but to kings, rulers, and entire nations. And unlike the emperors of old, his authority did not depend on borders. It moved across them. As Christianity spread deeper into Europe, newly formed kingdoms sought guidance, legitimacy, and unity. The Church provided all three. From the Frankish lands to the British Isles, rulers aligned themselves with Rome, not because they were conquered, but because they believed. This was a new kind of empire. Not enforced by armies, but held together by shared faith. The Pope's influence extended into every part of life. Laws were shaped by Christian values. Education was preserved through monasteries and clergy. Art, architecture, and culture began to reflect religious themes. Even time itself was measured through the rhythm of the Church, feasts, fasts, and holy days. In a fragmented Europe, the Church created a sense of order. But this power came with challenges. As kings grew stronger, tensions began to rise. Who held ultimate authority, the ruler of a kingdom, or the spiritual leader who claimed divine guidance? This question would define centuries of conflict. Yet even in those struggles, one truth remained clear. The papacy had become essential. It had survived the fall of Rome not by resisting change, but by adapting to it. Where the empire relied on control, the Church relied on connection. Where emperors ruled through fear, the Pope led through belief and presence. And that difference made all the difference. Because when the empire collapsed, fear spread. But belief endured. The Roman Empire once ruled the world. Its armies were unstoppable. Its emperors were absolute. Its power seemed eternal. But it fell. And when it did, everything changed. Out of the ruins, a new force emerged, not with swords, but with faith. Not through conquest, but through endurance. The popes did not inherit Rome's power. They rebuilt it, piece by piece, in a different form. They became diplomats in times of war. Leaders in times of crisis. Symbols of unity in a divided world. They stood when emperors vanished. They adapted when systems collapsed. And in doing so, they proved something history repeats again and again. True power is not just about strength. It is about survival. It is about transformation. It is about becoming what the world needs, when everything else falls apart. From the fall of the Western Roman Empire, to the rise of a spiritual authority that would shape centuries. This is how the popes survived Rome. And in surviving it, they changed history forever. The fall of Rome was not the end. It was the beginning of a new world. If you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Welcome to the story of time, where history comes alive. Watch next. The rise of the Byzantine Empire. The Dark Ages explained. How empires really fall. Until next time. History is not just the past. It's the story of us all.